Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wondered if there's an afterlife and answers to life's greatest questions, then do we have the show for you. Today I'll be talking with one of the world's leading authorities on NDEs, Dr. Raymond Moody, the best-selling author of Life After Life, who actually coined the term NDE, and literacy expert and the best-selling author of a brilliant book on final words called Words at the Threshold, about their elevating new project, the University of Heaven. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about life beyond life and answers to life's greatest questions from near-death experiences, shared death experiences, and even after-death experiences. That, plus we'll talk about Cante Bardo, making sense of nonsense, Carl Jung and a near-death experience, the mass hysteria of June bugs, poems and veil, and what in the world the wrestler Gorgeous George has to do with anything. Gotcha. So welcome to the show, Raymond, and welcome back, Lisa. Are you both ready to shine?
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
Woohoo! So before we dive right into things, and I did mention Jessica's now pregnant, and we're going to want to talk about where babies come from. We'll do that later, and we'll talk about the Cabbage Patch. But before that, Raymond, can you share briefly about your insight into people you've worked with who've had NDEs?
What happened was, I always like to say to set this up was when I was a kid, I just had zero religious. To me, it was just a very bizarre area of life that I didn't understand. And the idea of an afterlife to me was just nowhere. I thought it was a joke. But when I went to college at age 18, became a philosophy major, and through that I learned about near-death experiences because Plato and the other early Greek philosophers were very interested in these cases of people who apparently died and came back. So 3 years later, in 1965, I met an actual living person, Dr. George Ritchie, at the University of Virginia, who had had such an experience. And to make a long story short, since that time, I've interviewed literally thousands of people from all over the world who came to the brink of death and then had these phenomenal experiences. And I first got a PhD in philosophy, and then I taught philosophy for a while, and then I went to medical school and became a psychiatrist, ultimately working in forensic psychiatry. But throughout that career, I've just continued to interview people who came to the brink of death, and it has changed my life very much in terms of the question you propounded at the very beginning: is there an afterlife? Well, if you had asked me 5 or 6 years ago, I still don't know. I mean, I always understood that it's not what people say, the oxygen deprivation to the brain. It's not that, because the identical experience occurs often to people who are not themselves ill or injured, but who are there at the bedside of somebody who does. And as the one person dies, the bystanders have this same experience. So since they're not ill or injured, it means that it's not the oxygen deprivation to the brain. But what is it? I just didn't know. But I will say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I just give up. I don't know how else to put this together other than to say that apparently there's an afterlife. And one of the kind of cases, for example, that really brought me to this state of where I don't know what else to say is a wonderful man that we're going to interview. He's going to be in one of our first webinars. He's a graphic artist from out west, and some years ago he was in this horrific car crash in which he lost a leg instantly. His wife was killed instantly, and one of his children, but he lived and had this profound near-death experience. And then when he finally got up the courage to tell his doctor about it, which people often are reluctant to tell their doctor, but he did, and this very eminent trauma surgeon, as this man is, acknowledged that night in the hospital, he knew his patient wasn't going to die because, as he told this artist, he said, because I talked to your wife in the operating room. The dead wife of the artist was there. And then as word about this spread, the scrub nurse in the procedure said, yeah, me too. I didn't see her, but I heard her. And I could give you a dozen other cases like that. But at a certain point, I don't know what to say other than, to my utter astonishment, there does appear to be an afterlife.
Wow. And we're going to dive more into that in more detail. Before we do that, and thank you for sharing. Lisa, maybe you can tell us how you got interested in people's final words.
My father. I'm a linguist. My background's in language, and my father died over a 3-week period, relatively quickly and relatively unexpectedly. And as he was dying, I noticed interesting shifts in the way he was speaking. He went from, more literal language like "Lisa, bring me a glass of water," to increasing metaphoric and nonsensical language, and even beginning to talk about angels in the room, which really surprised me because my father was a hardcore skeptic and very PhD intellectual. And so I saw these changes, became very intrigued. I wrote everything down because as a linguist, that's what linguists do.
Yeah.
And when you hear something that baffles you, and then I just became obsessed and very curious with what I had witnessed, because it seemed that when I saw the language change, it seemed to be tracking something else going on with his consciousness or mind. And some months later, I met Dr. Moody, and we established the Final Words Project.
Woo-hoo.
And I had been sort of interested in this myself, Michael, because I had studied one of my areas in philosophy was logic and philosophy of language, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation in 1969 on a topic in philosophy of language. And I had been interested since I was a kid in Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss. And then in high school was when Shel Silverstein appeared. At first, he was just in Playboy, but then he eventually went out to kids' books too. And so I had always studied this. And then when I got into medical school, what I noticed was that when patients are ill, like with delirium or with certain kinds of intoxications, like mercury intoxication, or severe stress, or certain psychoses, then they lapse into talking nonsense, in which anybody in a hospital can tell you, for example, that when you have a delirious patient, they're just going on and on and on, and it never makes any sense. And so what I noticed, because of my background, was that when I would hear these patients talking nonsense involuntarily, it was the same types and patterns of nonsense that I knew from Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll. And so what I realized at that point was that nonsense is nonsense, whether it's deliberate or involuntary. So actually, since graduate school, I have been gradually working on trying to figure out what the rules and principles that are behind meaningless, unintelligible language. And it sounds so damn counterintuitive, but the fact is that common sense is totally wrong about nonsense. That nonsense is actually, paradoxically, I think, a more complex form of language than ordinary meaningful language. So that's how we got together.
I've got to ask more about this nonsense, because I know I go to weird. If you ask Jessica, my wife, in the middle of a conversation, I'll throw in bizarreness. And just stuff that doesn't necessarily make sense, and she has to decipher it. And if you ask me why, I'll say language is not my first language.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah, beautiful. That's
Language.
terrific.
I have to write that down.
That's a good one.
So what are you learning about nonsense then? And I'll put nonsense in quotes.
Well, I'm learning a lot of things. One of the things that's most astonishing to me is that in reality, people love nonsense. Doo-wop music, that's kind of before your time, but you've heard it. It's like sha-na-na-na-na, sha-na-na-na, or scat singing, Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, or playground rhymes and Dr. Seuss. So people love nonsense, but they don't like the word nonsense. So one of the courses we're going to be teaching at the University of Heaven eventually is we're going to guide people through entirely new ways where they can learn to think logically about words that technically lie beyond the pale. So, but the broader purpose, as you know, is we have a lot of wonderful people with near-death experiences that I've gotten to know over the years. And over the coming months, we're going to have webinars. Our first one is with Evan Alexander. You might know him.
Yeah,
Evan
we've had him on a couple times.
Yeah, good.
We love him.
And oh my God, we got some other great ones coming up. Michael, I don't know if you've heard about Anthony Chicoria.
No.
Oh my God, this is just an amazing story. Anthony is, first of all, a PhD in physiology and an MD, and his job is he is an esteemed professor of orthopedic surgery at NYU. And in 1996, Anthony got struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning and causing a cardiac arrest. And fortunately, a nurse was right there who resuscitated him. But he was able, during his near-death experience, to get out of his body. And he was at a family reunion. So he was able to describe to all the other family members what they were doing when, from the point of view down the hill, he was dead. And so, after this, even though he had never had any interest in music, he suddenly developed an interest in the piano and kept having a recurrent dream in which he was playing the same music on a piano on a concert stage, learned how to transcribe music so he could transcribe that piece. And now, in addition to being a famed orthopedic surgery professor, he's also now an acclaimed concert pianist. So we're going to be having him on, and another young man who's a famed composer who had the same sort of inspiration to his music. So
I want to share with you, it's hard to do it on audio. It's impossible to do on audio. But after the show, I'm going to send you a link. I just found it recently online. In 2006, I had my first NDE, and I saw light and color differently after that.
Yes.
And I started with a pinhole camera, and my pictures became all over the Boulder, the community centers and places and coffee shops in Boulder, and a few different galleries of how I was capturing light at sunrise and sunset. I stopped doing it when we got into some of our other work. There was only so much you can balance. And honestly, I was seeing so much, it was actually uncomfortable if I was or wasn't catching shots. I was too attached to it. But I found recently a collection online, and I'll send you a link to see this.
Thank you.
Because the talents that pop up after you've had these things, either latent talents or things, I would say no artistic ability to save my life. I was sent by a brother in Catholic high school, so not my brother, meaning Brother John or something, Brother Tim, was sent to the dean's office after in art class I had done a painting or drawing, and he said, "You can't possibly be that bad at art. You must be doing this just to piss me off," and sent me to the dean's office. And then this popped up. So this is amazing. So tell me more. What else? If we dive into NDEs, and I really want to go to shared experiences in a bit, are there similarities between some of the types of NDEs that come up?
Oh, yeah. It's the way it works is what I call a family resemblance, and that is that it's about 15 common elements that occur in near-death experiences all over the world. But one person may have one or two or three of those things, or 5 or 6 or 7, and rarely they may have the whole picture of the whole 15. And it seems to vary according to how far in they got. It's like the people with these extremely lengthy cardiac arrests that just go on and on and on are more likely to tell you the whole picture. But some of the common things that we all know of is people say that at the point where their heart stops beating, they may hear the doctor say, oh my God, he's dead, or words to that effect, which they often comment at that point. I've heard people say things like, I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead. Right? And so as this goes on, they say that they leave their physical bodies, they rise up, they can see the resuscitation going on down below. At a certain point, they sort of realize that has something to do with death. So they enter into a state of consciousness that no matter how articulate they may be, they say, I just can't describe it to you. It's just beyond words. But the way they try to describe it is they say they go through this passageway, like a tube or a tunnel or a hallway, and they come out on the other side into this very brilliant and warm and loving light. You just feel taken up in this comfort and peace and joy. And you may see relatives or friends of yours who have died, who are there and as sort of to help you through the transition. And they undergo panoramic memory, where everything they've ever done is displayed around them in a sort of hologram. And then when they come back from this, they tell us that whatever they had been chasing before, knowledge or power or fame or money, whatever, they say that what really comes up to you in this life review is the importance of learning to love. They say that's what it's all about. And they say after this experience, just no more fear of death, because they are convinced that what we call death is a transition into another reality.
Would you say many of them find themselves on a mission when they come back?
They do. And Michael, I studied, as you know, ancient Greek philosophy, and that's when I first came across these things. And one of the early Greek philosophers, he was even before Socrates and Plato goes way back, Heraclitus. He made a comment about these people who die and return. He said they are appointed to watch over the living and the dead. You say that they are sort of intermediate beings. And that's definitely what I have found. This Dr. George Ritchie, this first person I ever knew, living person who had one. To this day, Michael, I can say he was just the finest human being I ever knew in my life. And yet full of faults, which he acknowledged. He's like, George said to me one day, he said, you know, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And I've heard that same thought from a lot of people, but George was so kind. He wouldn't put it this way, but this is my translation of what he said. Yeah. What he meant was, let's face it, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And so what George was getting at is that you're still that same way, but you've had this vision of the importance of love, but then you really have to get busy, and putting it into practice is a different thing.
There's a line that I'll bleep here in a moment as for how I describe it. My return, so to speak, is integrations of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you should reread, if you probably read at some point Plato's Republic, but now at your age, go and get the Republic. It's about in the middle. Read the cave allegory. And that's exactly
yes.
what you just said. What you just said was that's what Plato said in the cave allegory. That's right.
Well, going along the lines of Plato and cave allegory, someone else who, when we think of psychology and we think of psychiatry, we think if we share these things with doctors, they're going to pull out the DSM 4 or 5 these days and they're going to diagnose us. But if we go back to Carl Jung,
yes,
what would he have to say? And the integration piece as well.
He would probably say, yeah, it happened to me too, because it did. And 1944, he had a heart attack and he had a near-death experience. It went up above his body. Then in some of his later writings, he talks about patients of his that had such an experience. So he knew about this, yeah.
Yeah, and from what I understand, when he came back, he didn't want to, and it's a quote in one of your books, he didn't want to eat or drink for weeks because he's doing, what am I doing here, stuck back in this little box?
That's right. And I know that feeling, I tell you. It's just, yeah. And it really changes people very dramatically. It's so there is something in the experience that has that effect on people. I have a very wise supervisor in psychiatry. His name was John Buckman. He was just one of the greatest people I ever knew in my life. And George Ritchie described to my friend John Buckman his life review. And John said that he, referring to Christ, because George identified this light as Christ, but what John said was that he put you through an intense years of psychotherapy in just a few seconds. And the people say that's how it feels, that it's just all this stuff that you see that you've done, because in your life review, you see each action you've done, but you don't re-witness it from the point of view you had when you did the action. When you see the action reviewed, you're reviewing it through the eyes and feelings of those with whom you've interacted. So if you see yourself doing something mean to somebody, then you feel the sad feelings directly that you brought about in that person.
Without judgment, would you say?
Yeah, without judgment. Yeah. And people were expecting judgment. George was 20 when he had his experience, and he said he came from this very strict Presbyterian thing, and the whole thing was that any sexual indiscretion is, that will surely send you to hell. And George said by the age of 20, he had a very active sexual career, not all of it with the opposite sex. And so he said there was everything in this review was all around. And he said, and I remember the look George had on his face when he said, and he didn't even mention them. What people say in this life review, what comes down is the love you gave to others. That's all they're interested in.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Lisa, how have you been struck by people's final words, and what struck you the most?
Wow. What struck me the most is that if you look carefully at the language, you can actually watch the pathway of consciousness as it changes and evolves. And it may be that we just slip into other states of consciousness. It's not that we really go anywhere. We just shift or transition, right? Shift dimension.
Different radio station.
Different radio stations. And it's almost like the nonsense. It seems like static to us. I got to think of the nonsense as almost, when you change stations on a radio and you go between frequencies, that static is to me like the nonsense. It's that place that doesn't quite come in clearly. Anyway, that was one thought I had. But what was amazing to me is when you freeze language, because for most of us, language is just this fluid thing that goes by. Most of us don't capture it. So we can't really track what's going on. But when you freeze language at a point of time, as we did with the Final Words Project for dozens of people at this point, you can start seeing the patterns of what's going on. So someone 3 weeks before they die start talking about waiting at the train station. And then this narrative goes on over 3 weeks. It's remarkable. It's like this living dream that's taking place. Or you'll see certain types of nonsense, certain constructions, paradoxical constructions, introductory offer, the store is closing. So the main thing that I learned is what seems like random gibberish. If you stop and you freeze it in time, you can begin to see certain kind of patterns. And to me, those patterns track some kind of shift in consciousness. The more I've studied them and the more I've grown to understand them. And then not only do you see the language change in very marked ways, but people start talking about seeing angels in the room. I mean, it's not just the language that shifts, but people's perceptions. So it's not just how they communicate what they are going through, but also what they're seeing. So now I was someone who, I was open-minded when I began this. I certainly wouldn't have said there is no afterlife, but I certainly did not feel it cellularly in the way that I do now. But in the 6 years that I've gathered these transcripts, now we're up to about 2,000 utterances that I've gathered. it's just cellular. It's how it might be for you as an NDE, experiencer. When you go through enough transcripts and hear enough people say, "Oh, wow, wow, wow," right? Steve Jobs, or someone say, "With after I have the scrambled eggs, where will you reappear?" What? Or my modality is broken, or you hear this rich language that, when you look at it more closely, actually has patterns in it. And when I looked at the kinds of nonsense, there's really maybe only 5 or 6 that seem most prevalent at end of life. And so then you have to ask, why? Why those 5 or 6? Because Raymond has identified many, many more in his research in the past. So I guess that's a long answer. It's just I really feel that the language of end of life, when it's frozen in time, when we look at it, can help us track consciousness.
Beautiful. And I don't recall the terminology for it, but have you seen many bursts? Like my grandmother came to life on her last day. The tube is taken out, and all of a sudden it seems like she's back. She's not passing away.
Yes. They used to call that fey. Look up the word fey, F-E-Y, in the dictionary. It's an antique word, but the sort of central definition is a state of heightened or enhanced consciousness that portends imminent death. And it's very interesting, Michael. I worked in medical school a lot, and with terminally ill patients, and it just occurred all the time. You would go into the hospital one day, and the family would come so excited because Grandma has turned around. She turned, and she's back now, and they take that as a sign that Grandma's going to keep on living. But then you have to tell them, no, it means that she's getting ready to go. And it's like, sometimes I've seen them with dementia, and it's just like months and months and no response, but just before they die. And you saw this, it's like they light up with a light, right?
That was Grandma.
And they talk to everybody, and not back to normal, but better than they ever were. It's like suddenly, it's like all their neuroses are just dropped off, and they are the pure person with that light coming out of them. It's just amazing.
What do you think's happening?
Well, I think, Michael, that what this means is that apparently when we die, our consciousness switches to a more energetic channel is all that I don't think there are any words for this, but what people tell me is that as soon as you're out of your body, you realize that this thing that you and I are in right now is a dream, and that people say that it becomes more real than real.
That's happening.
Right? Yeah. It's more real than real. Right.
So now, working with the terminally ill, when did you first experience the concept of a shared death experience?
Well, Michael, that kind of reminds me. I hear all the time about these stories about poor Dr. Moody. There he was studying all this, and the medical people thought he was nuts. And that's just a beautiful story, because I am a little bit of a martyr. But, that's a good, but in fact, it never happened. And by the time I went to medical school in 1972, I had already been studying this for 10 years. So my friends in medical school had sent the word wrong among the faculty that the student was coming in September who'd studied this. Within the first 2 weeks, 8 of the professors called me and got to thank you for doing this, because I had this myself, or I've seen this from my patients. So in that context, in about December or January of 72 or 73, I was in the bookstore, and this very nice woman approached me, and she said, "Dr. Moody, I've been wanting to meet you." She had identified herself as one of the medical professors there. I immediately recognized her name. But she took me across the campus and told me that sometime before she had been trying to resuscitate her own mother. But when her mother died, she herself, the medical doctor, felt she left her body. She could see her body and her mother's body down below. she trying to look around. She became aware of her mother there with her, and she saw her mother recede into this light, and the dead relatives of the mother coming. And so you see, she wasn't ill or injured. And so I realized that, and yet she had the same experience. So that means that it's not the oxygen deprivation to the brain. There's got to be some other factor or factors.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned mother, because fast forward a little while, and when your mom passed away, what happened?
You know, I had been studying these shared death experiences, and in 1994, I was starting up a group, and we were going to do a systematic study of them. But it happened to be on Mother's Day, 1994, so I called my mom to wish her a happy Mother's Day. To make a long story short, found out she had had a rash the day before, but they didn't think anything about it. But then, to make a long story short, the next day after I talked to her, she went to the doctor and she was given 2 days to 2 weeks to live. And so my wife and I and my sisters and brother-in-law were there. And as my mother died, I had this, I guess, empathic death experience, and something I'd been studying for 20 years. But, you know, when it happens to you, it really paradoxically, I lost interest in that topic at that point because I'd experienced it myself. Then some years passed, and I finally decided, well, it's time to get back to this. But when I had the experience myself, I had to integrate it, I think, in a different way. So, yeah, I've we just get communications all the time from people who have been there at the bedside of a dying loved one, who, as their loved one dies, say that they get out of their body and they go part way toward this light with their dying relative, where they may see the apparitions of the deceased loved ones of the dying person come in to escort them. And most remarkably of all, I have a number of cases where the bystander actually empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person. Yeah, and to me, that's just shocking, right? Because, I'm not even comfortable with the idea of sitting in on my own life review, much less the idea of a spectator looking in.
Well, you've mentioned like parents or like a mom seeing their son's life review.
And for a long time, I assumed, well, it has to be somebody close. But just a few years back, we got a communication from a medical doctor who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on before. But as he was trying to resuscitate this guy, he said he was surrounded by images that were obviously the life of the patient that he was. And this to me is just something really remarkable. One thing that may prevent a few hyperventilation spells from people listening to this is that people say that it's not embarrassing like you would think it. Because, as I learned as a psychiatrist, we all have pretty much the same secrets. So what strikes me about people who have these empathic life reviews with their dying relatives is how natural it seems, that it's not like shocking or intrusive as you might imagine, but that it just seems something very natural.
Wow. So I want to talk more about a few of these things, but before we do that, how did you come to start this university? What's the goal? What are you hoping that people get out of this? Because you're compiling all of your years of research now into this mission.
Well, for 20 plus years, I've always wanted to. I love teaching, and it's getting harder for me to travel around, I'll tell you the truth, at 74. But, it's been hard for years. So I got this idea, 20 years ago, wouldn't it be great to have a sort of online service where I could do my lectures? And I don't know anything about this stuff. And then Lisa here and I met about 8 years ago. And I don't know who came up with the idea. It just sort of evolved in talking because we just really enjoy working together. And so it just evolved. And so the universityofheaven.com, we're going to do seminars, and we're starting with a free webinar on October 30th, and it's called I'm Convinced, and I'm going to be talking about what finally led me a few years ago to sort of give up and say, yeah, to my utter astonishment, there is life after death. And so then go to the website and just look around, and we've got a lot of wonderful programs coming up.
And I just want to say that Raymond is a very, very humble person, and I think a jewel and a treasure. And I felt that he is getting older, and I wanted to create a site that would be his legacy site, because there's so much that he has done for this field, and he offers to so many of us. And almost everyone who's going to be on the University of Heaven are people who've been deeply influenced and mentored, such as myself, by Raymond. And I just wanted to bring everyone together in a community of learning together and exploring this topic together, and also as a way, a tribute to Raymond Moody.
Yeah, and you know, it's I push Lisa's books now more than I do mine, because this thing that Lisa is doing, this is to me, this is the cutting edge, Michael, on the whole near-death research thing. Is like to find out what people are saying as they are dying.
What is the difference between near-death experiences and after-death experiences? Because you're talking about where the mind goes.
Yeah.
Well, my take on that is, in a way, Michael, these people with near-death experiences, the reason I called them near-death experiences is that none of them were dead, right? Because if your heart stops beating even for 10 minutes, but you are revived, that means by definition that you weren't dead. And so then the question is, well, these people have near-death experiences, but what about people who are really dead? You know, that one seems harder to verify. However, my take on it is this: as you probably experienced yourself when you dipped over to the other side, time stood still, right, or just vanished. And so, in a way, the question doesn't arise if you think about it, because when somebody comes close to death, they say that they zip away into a timeless, spaceless environment. So at that point, it really doesn't, you can't really say that it's after death anyway, because there's no time, right? Apparently, as soon as you die, you get into a framework that is outside of space and time.
Can we can we get in touch with people if we've had shared death experiences, which are taking us like partway through the tunnel or fully to a life review? Can we actually meet with those who've passed away?
I think so. I wouldn't have said that years ago, but I do now. After my father passed away, well, through the final, writing his words down, and through his final words, I connected with them. That experience of having shared death connections or a shared crossing, it happened because as I was tracking his words, it was almost like I entered into his dimension or his world. And then when he passed on, a few weeks later, I started hearing these poems. And my father said, give these to your mother. And I didn't question it. It wasn't for me to doubt it. I just wrote them down. And so I don't know. Was that my imagination? Was that just a piece of consciousness? I don't know how to make sense of it, but it felt very real to me. And the poems gave my mother's, comfort. And there's so many stories of people seeing loved ones appear, and it's corroborated, right? Something happens, they give them information that later turns out to be true, like what the gender of their baby might be, or something like that, right? And you've heard so many stories of after-death communication. How do we make sense of that? I don't know, but I will say that I know it exists. I do know it exists.
I've been a knowledge junkie all my life, Michael. And I can honestly tell you that one of the weirdest pieces of knowledge that I have is that, number one, as you and I both know, we all know that you hear all the time from people who've lost loved ones who tell you, if I only had 5 more minutes, right? Well, in the real world, Michael, in reality, there are at least two very reliable means, which are very well known since antiquity, and were even known in the United States up until the radio age, where people stopped, rather than interacting in the living room, they would listen to the radio and then later watch TV. But prior to that time, there were very well known means of getting in touch with your dead relatives. One is the dream incubation method, where you write a letter to your loved one and you spill out your feelings and your questions, and you close the letter and you put it under your mattress. And what this does, it sets off a process where at some point in the middle of the night, you'll feel that you just are there with your dead relative. And then the other is the psychomantion procedure, which was the basis of the oracles of the dead in ancient Greece, where they had a reflective surface.
Yeah.
And you would be prepared down there for a month, but then you would gaze into this body of, it was a cauldron filled with water and olive oil and then the dim illumination. And you can do that very easily. You set up a mirror in a dark room and you go through process, and it's a very common, very easy thing to, if that's what you wish, to get in touch with your dead relatives. But the reason that fact is so amazing to me is, why doesn't everybody know that? Right? That it just seems so bizarre to me that there's millions and millions of people out there who want so much to contact a dead relative, and there is equipment right in their own home for doing it, but we just don't know.
I think a lot of people are going to be rewinding this to about this point, go to approximately 45 minutes and replay these methods. I know we teach something for completely different purpose. We teach automatic writing to people, which is kind of trance state writing, you could say. And so many people have come back to me and said, I spoke with Mom. I spoke with Dad.
Yeah.
Such and such just passed away, and now I was able to get back in touch with them. So it's there and it's real.
And I have to say this, we are going to, in April, do a webinar about the psychomantia.
Yeah.
And we'll let folks know about it, where people will teach them how at home to build this device, I guess, that's based on the oracles of the dead. And people have had incredible results with it. And it creates sort of really a trance space for people to connect with apparitions. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. What's the URL one more time?
Take it away, Raymond. www.theuniversityofheaven.com.
Fantastic. All right.
Thank you.
Earlier, Lisa, you had mentioned something about babies. I want to go in this babies direction now, because we're talking about
wonder why.
after death. However, let's talk about pre-birth, where they're coming from, anything that we've learned from near-death experiences, from linguistics, from the works, since we have a baby on the way.
Yeah. Hooray.
That's a woohoo! What can you tell us?
My recommendation, Michael, is you're going to be so surprised at how quickly they pick up and that they know things. I mean, it's just utterly astonishment. If you watch it, you see how quickly. And it's a very common thing where young children will remember their past lives. And I should explain to you that my wife and I, we're not religious. We don't go to any sort of ceremonies. We don't talk about life after death at home. We talk about the phone bill, what's for dinner, the homework for the kids. And my kids didn't even know until they read on the internet a few years ago that I was about my book, Life After Life. But both of our kids have specifically remembered past lives. And my recommendation, because this is what we did, we acknowledged what they were saying, but we didn't ask any questions because you are afraid to shape it.
Yeah.
But because of that, I think that they still talk about it once in a while. I took my daughter to Japan about a year ago, and I heard her at another table discoursing to the other people on the table about how her memory of how she was born. She said, God pointed you out to me. And he said, you got to go down to be his daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? And she said, oh, I didn't want to do it. She said, I wanted to stay with my Gotti, but she said, but he pushed me down to be. And I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? And she said, yeah, sure. So kids will tell you this. And most adults just don't listen, but if you listen, and my recommendation is not to grill them about it. Don't ask questions, but just let them talk.
Do you think they come? We talk about a life review, and there's this concept like of a council of elders, of going before them, choosing the body, choosing the parents, and choosing a soul mission.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Plato certainly says that, and he has a very brilliant, beautiful description of it in the Republic, where that very thing, he says, you go to this place and you look down at a flat place, it sounds like a screen, sort of. And he said, and on that surface are displayed all the different kinds of lives you could choose. And there's somebody there with you, like a guide. And the guide says to you, whatever life you choose, it will not affect the quality of your soul, which seems to indicate that it's entertainment. Right? Just go and learn.
And with a soul mission.
Yeah. And I wonder if you can even know why you're here. It's like, in a way, it would compromise your effectiveness if you knew your mission.
Well, that gets at really the big picture question here today. It was something I was talking with somebody about just before the show, which is, if this is not real, if this is holographic, if this is, call it a rent-a-suit, but it's actually in a hologram.
Yeah. Rent-a-suit, that's great.
Why? Why are we here then?
Oh, I think we're here to learn. I do believe in the idea of the soul evolving. That feels real to me. I mean, just going based on feelings about it. And we look at traditions, all kinds of traditions that talk about reincarnation. But I had the experience with Cante Bardo, which you mentioned, where this character came to me one morning, because I write my journal and I do meditate. And he said, I'm Carlos Pena, and I want to tell you my story. And it was much like the automatic writing that you talk about. He just came through me and kept writing and writing. And I just went until I just about finished. My goodness, I wrote for 4 days, probably wrote about 100 pages. And his story was about being between lives and having to make up for something he did in past life. But as I wrote the story, I had this very real sense that we are evolving souls. That feels real to me. I mean, think about how I've grown in this one lifetime, and growth is what seems to be what it's about, besides love and growing towards love. Yeah.
Some years ago, before your time, Michael, when I was a kid, there was this great writer, Elie Wiesel. Okay. He had been and he had been in Auschwitz, and he was just a wonderful scholar, very sensitive and articulate man. And something he said in one of his books, he said, God made man because he loves stories. And what is your life but your story, right? And God is watching is watching every person's life story, and also how they're interacting. So I think that the essence of your identity is your life story, and that this is what this is all about, is that we're learning different life stories with the ultimate aim, I think, of being in some higher state of existence, which we can hardly even imagine from the situation we're in now.
Thank you. Does learning about near-death experience, does learning about the linguistics, all of these pieces, help us to reach, not as I'm a level 1 human, I'm a level 2 human. That defeats the whole purpose. That's ego coming in the back door. But can we use this knowledge to help? I mean, that's the whole goal of the show at the end of the day, is to raise people's vibration, shift consciousness, and elevate humanity. Can this knowledge help do that?
I believe so. Kenneth Ring wrote a book called Lessons from the Light, And in it, he talked about this benign virus that for those of us who have done research in this field, it's contagious. And there is no doubt in my mind in the last few years, I have experienced what you might call expanded consciousness. I mean, in the very simple way that I used to be scared of going on an airplane, I'm not afraid anymore because I have total faith about what is to come next. And to live life with that kind of faith is just, I mean, I'm living more fearlessly. I'm living with less fear, and that's a huge gift. And people who have stories, as you do, near-death experiencers, bring all of us this tremendous insight. And of course, integrating all of that into our day-to-day lives is challenging, but to expand it's so possible, and so it's what it's about. It is what it's about. So I believe this work can, in so many ways, affect us positively and inspire us, definitely.
And you both have, there's a certain je ne sais quoi, this thing about you that when you get it, whether it's from the experience itself or from being bathed the experiences as you both have, I call it like the Buddha laugh. There's a joy of life, a lightness even in the seriousness, or a seriousness even in the lightness of it that just comes through you.
Oh, thank you.
It's lovely. Thank you.
So on that note, I don't want people to listen today without taking action. What one homework assignment for each of you would you give people today to take action based on what they're learning and to help elevate their consciousness?
Well, of course, if anyone is bedside or near someone they love who's dying, if you can write down their final words, do it, because it in itself is almost an oracle. And otherwise, language is phenomenal. I would do what you've been advising your listeners to do. Also, sit down with an empty mind and just see where the pen takes you, and you may be very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. I like to tell people to, like a good way to start with this is just before you go to bed at night, think about some problem you're working on and just sort of put it in your mind and then forget it. And it's, as Freud observed, this was one of his 7 arguments for the existence of the unconscious mind, that when you wake up in the morning, it's just like the problem is suddenly clear. And so you must have been working on it overnight, but don't realize that you are.
I love that tool. Any advice? Jessica always wants me to ask a question for parents and their kids. I know we heard about listening to the kids without guiding them along. Any advice you would both give to parents and their kids based on what you've learned?
Definitely. Well, you talked about having a learning disability. I hate that word. Learning differently.
I put it in quotes.
I just hate that.
And it's all labels. It's all labels.
But we all do learn differently. And I think one of the most important things, and a gift my parents gave me that has really expanded through this research, we do, remember how you talked about your senses being intensified through the near-death experience? And I think that we all process sensory information in this world and the world beyond in very different ways, and to really honor those experiences for our kids, however it may be, and also help them ground what unusual things they see and help them integrate it, because that's one of the big challenges of being here on planet Earth together.
My only advice about your kids is just to love them and keep saying you love them. That's the main thing. It's amazing. Like many families, people don't want to say I love you, but I think that's very important for kids to hear that.
And grown-ups.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I like to say we came from love. We are love. We couldn't be anything other than love, no matter how we tried. And that's what we learn on the other side. And yet we're given this amnesia, this veil where that's the one thing we completely forget when we're back or when we grow up.
Plato observes that in the Republic, Michael. And
I got to go back to the Republic.
Oh my God, you just won't believe it. See, that when you have an experience with that later in life, it's pretty amazing. And what Plato says, he was talking about, like, why don't we remember our past lives? And to put it in modern terms, he said that it's like an event boundary. And what an event boundary is, it's an experience that everybody listening to this has had. And it has to do with the fact that your mind, to process things, puts them in little packets. And when you get outside of that area, you may not be able to recover that knowledge. And the example that everybody knows is you're sitting in your living room, and then you think of something you want to get in the kitchen, right? And so what happens as soon as you walk through the door into the kitchen, you forget what you came in for, right? And Plato says it's something like that. And, if we tried to live this life with all the input from other lives coming in, it'd probably be very confusing.
It's a very good point for myself. I'd have to then throw myself back in the living room or in my head and then walk back through the doorway to see what it was.
Right. That's right. Another thing to do is you can say to yourself inwardly, there's something I'm blocking. And then you just forget it. And usually just automatically within a few seconds, it'll pop back up.
Beautiful. So what are you both excited about learning about moving forward?
I think what I'm most excited about learning about moving forward is just allowing myself to be more of who I am, just be more eccentric, less afraid, and learning just ways of doing that and expressing it.
And what's so exciting to me, one of the many things that's so exciting to me, Michael, about the University of Heaven is that I love people, and at the same time, I'm a social phobic. So, it's very paradoxical, but it's nonetheless true. And to me, this is just so great, a way that I can relate to people all over the world and the country and won't have to travel, which is getting increasingly difficult to me. So I'm looking forward to this as an instrument to get out in touch with a lot of people who, like Lisa and me, are just really fascinated by these big questions of existence and want some sort of serious forum to do it in. We are catering to the very people who are really, really seriously interested in this question.
Beautiful. And then one more time, the URL then.
theuniversityofheaven.com. www.theuniversityofheaven.com.
Oh, Raymond.
Fantastic. And if you didn't catch, you practiced, www.theuniversityofheaven.com, come on over to inspirenationshow.com and we'll get you over to www.theuniversityofheaven.com. This has been truly phenomenal, a gift, a joy, a treat. Superlatives could go on. Before I let you go, each one individually or together, any last words of wisdom you want to share with people?
I would just say to everybody, thank you so much for watching in. This is just really great. And I'm hoping we did something good for the many people who are listening today. So thank you so much.
Woohoo! So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, check out the University of Heaven and begin understanding life beyond life today, and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you guys so much.
You are amazing, Michael.
Great, Michael.
Michael, I am so curious. Do you have a few minutes? I'd love to hear a little bit. I do have someone who just walked in the door, but I'm still dying of curiosity. Can you tell me about at least one of your near-death experiences or both of them? I'm so curious.
Neither of them was as fancy as the majority. I'd be, I guess if there's scale 1 through 15, I'm at the baby side of the scale. So the first experience did actually involve a baby. I had been training for a world record skate across the country to help people with learning disabilities. A 5,000-mile skate, sponsored by Rollerblade. I'd been meditating in a creek after a skating session and praying for safety and guidance for my upcoming skate and wondering if I should be doing it. I then laced up my skates, went down a bike path, said, "Go slow, Michael. It's a Sunday. There'll be tourists out." Rounded a bend going slowly, had a little GPS watch on it, recorded 7 miles per hour was the last recording, before a father stepped out onto the bike path,
Ouch.
teaching a baby how
Oh.
to walk.
Oh, no.
Oh, my God.
And I threw myself, throw is a weird term. I used to tell people I made a choice, hit the baby or hit the deck. There was no choice. I found myself moving up and backwards. I couldn't tell you. I'm not a good hopper, skipper, or jumper. I don't know how it happened. Up and back and rotated and managed to land while avoiding the baby. I saw them as I was landing, and it was an instant change.
Oh,
No time. There was no tunnel or anything. One person flying through the air, a different person hit the deck.
Wow.
I heard the bones explode.
Wow.
And I paused there for a minute, and I don't remember which occurred first. I know when I opened my eyes and I didn't hit my head, that all the EMTs, "Did you hit your head?" I'm like, "No, I didn't." I had this beaming ear-to-ear grin, an understanding of the world that superseded any understanding before. I was the most joyous you can possibly imagine.
Unbelievable.
I had to take my left leg and flop it over my right. The femur was pushing into the femoral artery, the parts of the bone. And then I just laid there basking in this just love and joy and excitement, and that's why everybody who came to me, "Did you hit your head? Did you hit your head?" And I'm like, "No, life is good. Life is good." Now I did say to at least one EMT, I'm like, "I'm trying to meditate here. I'm in a lot of pain." But I mean, I took a photo of myself on the gurney as I'm in the hospital, and the doc's like, "I've got to get you into surgery because you're going to lose your leg or lose your life. You're compartmentalizing."
Oh, my gosh.
And I just had this unbelievable grin on my face. I went back to that spot for the next 7 years, put my hand on a tree right next to where I fell. There now appears in the bark, the last time I saw it, like there's an imprint of my hand, and give thanks. It's a new me from that moment, a completely different meaning of life, purpose of life, everything.
Oh, amazing. Thank you.
So I'll let you go. Be well, Lisa. Raymond, keep in touch if you want to speak again at some point, even off air. Would love it and be honored.
Thank you. Oh, what a pleasure it's been. Really. Goodbye.
So, what an honor. Be well. Have a magical day.
Be well. Bye.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!